In this age where there's a lot more talk about biological aging and it's sometimes used a little bit flippantly, and you have your Spotify age, etc. Like the reason we partnered with Buck was because there's so much need for us to stick to the science and to keep this field longevity science versus just longevity. So we're going to talk a little bit about the brain. What I'm showing here is an electrical visualization of the brain. The brain is quite beautiful, it's quite intricate. So this is representing the signals of the brain, the electrical signals, and every trace is a thought. Every trace is decision forming, a memory being retrieved. And most of us haven't seen what our brain does. And that's starting to change. There's more and more activity in the neurotechnology space. So that's what I want to talk to you about. So this is personal for me. In 2015, I had a motor vehicle accident. So I was rear-ended, and I ended up with neck surgery and also nerve damage and a concussion and PTSD. But the worst part of it for me was my brain. It wasn't actually my body, even though it was in a lot of pain. And so it was such that I couldn't keep a thought through a meeting. Like my brain fog was that thick, and my hypervigilance response was so severe that my 6-year-old couldn't come up and spontaneously hug me. My body saw every unexpected touch as a threat. And so, I went looking for answers, and I found neurofeedback. So neurofeedback is a very powerful neuromodulation technology, and it changed my life. So it profoundly and definitively changed my life. But the real problem for me with it was the measurement. So they use QEEG to measure the effects of neuromodulation, usually in clinics. And what I found was that even before I was back to my regular self, my QEEG showed normal. QEEG basically tracks how your standards of deviation from normal. And then what I found was that I improved so much more than what I was before using this sort of technology. And now the QEEG was actually that much less useful. Nothing could really track my progress towards optimal. And that's what I was looking for. I was looking for objective, precise measurement to track towards optimal. And so I set out to solve that problem. And that was the beginnings of Sensei. And so in this room, and certainly, in the booths out there, we're measuring everything to do with body, right? We got DEXA scans, we got blood markers, we're tracking our HRV, we're tracking our sleep, our steps. And what's missing from our dashboard is the brain. And it is the single largest predictor of how long we will live. And so that stat, I'm pulling this from a study from last year by a Stanford team that was published in it was published in Nature Medicine, and they looked at 11 organs, and they had 45,000 people in the study, and they asked a very simple question, and it was, which of these organs best predicts your longevity? And they used blood proteomics. There was a blood biomarkers to determine that age of these organs. And it was the brain. It wasn't the heart, like a lot of people expect, or the kidneys or the lungs. It was the brain that was the largest predictor. And it actually wasn't just about longevity or immortality. It was actually also about Alzheimer's risk. So it was about health span. So someone with a younger brain, someone with an older brain had 12 times more likelihood of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's than someone the same age who had a younger aged brain. And that was regardless of their genetics. So certainly if we're going to measure one organ, it should be this one. But the brain has been longevity's blind spot. So it declines silently, right? So when we look in the mirror, we know what's aging, and we know that it's very evident to everybody else as well. And so that draws our attention. But the brain, the decline of the brain, we explain it away. We think, oh, it's stress, or I didn't sleep that well, or this is normal for my age. It's normal to forget some words sometimes. And so by the time that it is visible, it's often too late to change the trajectory. unless there was a way for us to look at what the brain is doing and the shifts in the brain earlier. So how do we measure the brain? There are really 4 ways that people try to measure the brain. So the first one is structurally. So we all know about MRIs. And so MRIs, unfortunately, they catch the aftermath, right? So by the time that it shows on an MRI, you've already lost significant function. And then there's blood tests, and that's great, but they're a proxy, right? They can only get so precise. They're looking at correlations with brain function. And then there's EEG. So there's a whole bunch of new like EEG technology that's coming out, and I'm sure you've seen. So the thing with EEG is that it also has its drawbacks. So I talked about QEEG before. So EEG and QEEG, they're very, very susceptible to how much caffeine you had that day, how much sleep you had. So for repeatability in terms of testing, it's actually it's imperfect. And then there's output, right? So this is cognitive testing that is very, very simple. You probably see a lot of free apps that'll do reaction time and things like that. So besides the issues with lag and different Wi-Fi, different screen flickers, the output testing also has a problem. And the problem is that you could have the same score, so let's say you do a cognitive test alongside your teenage son or your daughter in her early 20s, and then you think, we got the same reaction time or we got the same accuracy in these answers in memory recall. So certainly our brains are equally healthy. And that's just simply not true, right? And I'm just going to illustrate why. Right, so 2 engines running at the same speed, same output, and they look identical from the outside. But if you were to look under the hood, one of them is running quiet and cool, and the other one's running hot. And the one that's running hot is having to work twice as hard for the same output. So you can't tell unless you look under the hood. So it's the same for the brains, right? So the aging brain. One of them could be actually straining to keep up, whereas the other one is running efficiently. So how do we look under the hood? And this is where Sensei has been focused. So we do think that capturing outputs is really critical. So we do capture outputs as well. And then EEG, as long as you're solving for the volatility of the state that you're in that day, which we do, so we have a proprietary method of solving for that, then it's actually quite insightful. More insightful is ERPs, which are a little bit lesser known. And ERPs are the electrical signals of the brain while your brain is under load. So it's doing a task. And this has been around for decades in lab environments. It's used in pharmaceutical trials. It's actually very difficult to capture because it requires 1 millisecond precision. So our focus was on making these ERPs we were able to capture them in a portable device that maintains that precision. And you can think of it, the distinction between the EEG and ERPs, you can think of it as a treadmill stress test versus a resting pulse. So ERPs are happening all the time. So they're not just confined to a test. They are basically happening the first half a second, the first 500 milliseconds of every time you receive new information. So they're happening right now, and they're happening all day long. And so measuring them gives us a lot of insight into how you're functioning all day long. And I'm just gonna slow down that first 500 milliseconds. So in the first 100 milliseconds, you're just perceiving all the information. Everything's coming in. You got a siren, you got the smell of coffee, you got 10 conversations of people passing past you, right? And your brain is filtering so that you don't get overwhelmed. So your brain will not actually let that pass your filter, but that which does get passed gets classified. So that first step was filtering, now we're on classifying. And so then it says, that sound was a siren, that smell was fresh coffee, right? That face was someone familiar. That's 200 milliseconds. By 300 milliseconds, your brain has made a decision that is on response. How will I respond? I'm gonna turn my head, I'm gonna step left, If I prematurely step into the intersection, my brain will call to my attention that I've classified the do not walk sign, and it'll actually do an impulse control on an action that I was already in the middle of. So there's an impulse control element. And now, if you're walking alone at night, it's a different context. And so now your brain's actually filtering less. It's letting more information in. It's scanning the environment. It's listening for the footsteps behind you, the peripheral movements in your eyesight, and it's checking danger, not danger, faster than you can turn your head. And here in a restaurant where there's a lot of conversations happening, now you are at dinner with somebody and you're focused on that one conversation, and then you can filter out all the others unless you hear your name. And now you're not listening for your name. You didn't purposely mean to, but your brain will bring that to your attention. And now suddenly you're listening to that conversation as well to see if they're talking about you, right? And so all of this, the signals, they are getting weaker, they're getting slower, and they're getting less reliable as the brain ages. And so it's actually very important to capture these. They're very, very telling. So at Sensei, we capture 3 streams of data. We talked about the outputs, we talked about the EEG and the ERPs. And so all of that information comes into our system. It's a set of headphones. And then we're capturing with 1 millisecond precision. So this is billions of calculations, it's millions of data points, and we end up with thousands of biomarkers. And in that process, we discovered 277 novel composite features, which means that these are interactions that no one had found before between these 3 streams of data. And they turned out to be the biggest predictors of brain age that are fundamental to our biological brain age clock. So most measurement that is out there is actually just snapshots. So even the ERP is a snapshot, right? And so if you want to know more than just where you are and you want to know where you're going to capture that trajectory, you need an aging model. And so in longevity science, we talk about that as a biological clock. And so that is what we built, and ours is called Brain Years. And so we fed it the outputs, the ERPs and the EEG. And it's the first functional brain age clock, which is unique because so there's others based on bloods, there's others based on structure. Function is an important approach because it's upstream from structure, so we can catch things earlier, and it's more precise than bloods. So it's an interesting area of investigation for, I think, the whole biological clock family function. So needless to say to this crowd, the gap is the signal. So you're 40 years old, your brain is 30 or your brain is 50. That gap between your chronological age and the biological age that you get back from the test, that is the signal that tells you what your trajectory is, and then hopefully it's actionable. So this is probably, I think, the most interesting slide here. There's a lot of talk about biological age. Sometimes people are using it quite flippantly. There's 2 numbers that we should know as an educated audience. So they're the Pearson correlation value, often referred to as just the R value, and there's the mean absolute error, so the MAE. So R's are 0.92 and 4.4 years. And to understand that number, we can think about it like, what if the Pearson correlation was 1 and the mean absolute error was 0? So what does that look like? That would be a perfect clock. That would be that I would know from a test how old somebody is without any error and perfectly right on the dot. And so that would be a very expensive calendar, essentially, right? It's too perfect, right? There's no biological signal. So you have to find the sweet spot on that biological signal. And so we held ourselves to the gold standard for brain, which is MRI. And so ours are on par with the MRI standard. And I mean, I think it's pretty great. It's stable between all the ages is another really important thing. It's not just like one band of ages. It's from 18 years old to 89 years old stability. But the clincher is that our longitudinal precision is 0.07 years. And what that means is that if you test and retest, and we recommend every couple months, the only movement is 0.07 years if there's no intentional intervention. So it's an incredibly stable clock. These are not numbers that move. The clock has been adjusted for caffeine and sleep and all that sort of stuff. So it's not volatile. So that means that if you were a clinic doing brain years testing, then that sweet spot, that gap, and if your brain years clock moves for your client, it's solid. It's a solid trajectory. So like we started the talk today saying, we partnered with the Buck Institute, and then we published our results. We actually pre-published our results on bioRxiv, so anyone can read about the clock and the intervention and how we came to these numbers. I think that transparency is really, really important. And then I think the obvious next question is, can we move it, right? Because measurement without an intervention, without a path forward, is just a number. And so I think everybody's kind of getting wary of that, right? So what we have is, and this is, again, we did this study with Buck, we have an intervention that's an at-home neuromodulation program. So it's largely neurofeedback in its core, but it also has transcranial photobiomodulation, HRV biofeedback, and binaural beats, and meditation. So it's a simple sort of consumer at-home system. The Sharp Mind protocol, which is one of the many protocols on that system, after 2 months was able to reverse the brain years by 5.18 years. So that exceeded my expectations. And that's just the mean, right? So some people, it was 15 years. Like it was quite nice. This is people between 35 and maybe 85 years old. And a lot of them going into it had brain fog, right? So by the end, 80% reported improved memory and improved clarity. That's the self-reported part. But the hard numbers were 40.6% less errors, 10.2% increased processing speed. And this is all available on the bioRxiv. But it's still early. This is like exciting data. We're very proud of it, but it's very early, right? So we know that there's going to be situations where the trajectory is harder to move. And we're a team that's very committed to this learning, the constant learning, and understanding the why. So it's just early days. But this system that we've built, because it is this closed loop system of assess, intervene, reassess, is a system that's built to basically figure that out, right? We can learn and we can improve. So the brain years that we're launching is for clinics, right? We think it's really important for this to sit with clinics and then for the intervention to be at home, but then reassess at the clinics. And so this is what the report looks like. This is a sample report, and you can see there's 4 domains that we're giving reports on. So the client would see right away what percentile they sit in these 4 domains. So information processing, performance output, attention, and self-regulation are the 4 categories. And then they would be given also recommendations, personalized recommendations in this automated report in the areas of neuromodulation, so the system that we have that they can take home, but also on nutrition, on sleep, on stress, and exercise. So a lot of us think of brain health, brain aging as something that we don't really need to worry about today. That's something for later. It's related to Alzheimer's and dementia. But what if it's actually noticeable in the shifts that are anxiety in our 30s, loss of focus in our 40s? And what if we could detect it years earlier? We can detect it decades earlier. And what if it doesn't have to decline at all? What if we can optimize? So our brain holds everything, right? It holds our judgment, it holds our expertise, it holds our memories and our identity. So I think right now we're in an age where intelligence is being redefined. And what could be more important than protecting what makes you you? So we're launching this spring with some select clinics, and it's 643 biomarkers, 15 minutes, and one number and a path forward. So we have a booth outside if you guys want to come say hi. Brainyours.com is where you get more information. You can sign up and download the study, download the sample report. Oh, and that's it.